The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Glad to have you all here. I'm glad to be here. Lang, Baker, I hope you're glad to be here.
Absolutely.
I'm sure glad to have you. Anyway, tonight, well, this is a live call-in show. I always forget to remind people of that. This is a live call-in show, A Pause for Thought. You can call in at 343-9927 and give us your thoughts and questions on the topic of the evening. You can also live stream us on whyr.org if you'd like, if you're outside of our broadcast range. But you can still call in at 343-9927. Now, tonight's topic is sanctuary cities. What are they all about? What's the big deal with them? And I guess I looked up some definitions, and they're all pretty general, although I would point out, Lang, that there's generally a consensus that there's no legal term, there's no firm term for what they are. But generally, sanctuary cities today in the United States are cities or counties across the United States that limit their cooperation with federal authorities when those authorities ask them to detain undocumented immigrants. They're not shielding them or protecting them, they're simply not attempting to apprehend them and hold them for the feds. They're just letting them go. And there's obviously a big to-do about it now. I think the President-elect Trump has said that he's going to cut funding to all cities that do that. Is this a relatively new thing, Lang?
Well, the specifics of the way sanctuary cities and sanctuary counties and states are working today on the immigration issue is distinct. Sanctuaries, as a general matter, have been around from ancient times. Greece had a policy where people could seek sanctuary in holy sites. Slaves and thieves could go to the shrines of gods and be safe from civil authorities.
Okay, slaves I can understand, but thieves? Right now in American sanctuary cities, at least regarding illegal immigrants, they are not protecting criminals. They're just protecting illegal people who are here undocumented.
Well, in a sense, yeah, this actually, in another sense, well, it varies from place to place. There's not one model statute for sanctuary cities that have been adopted by a bunch of cities all over the country. It's just a practice that some jurisdictions have undertaken because they don't have the resources, in some cases, to be in the business of enforcing federal law. They are concerned with the laws of their jurisdiction, whether it's a municipal or state or whatever. And so they don't go looking for people who are here without papers, who are here illegally.
In fact, that was an argument made by a spokesperson for New Orleans Police Department when Jeff Landry, the Louisiana's Attorney General, let's see if I can find that story here. Yeah, Jeff Landry was outraged at the consent decree that supposedly forced New Orleans to become a sanctuary city because they passed an ordinance that forbade their cops from going after people for immigration violations. And this spokesperson pointed out that it's not our job to enforce federal law. You know, it's
right, and some of the policies could border on racial profiling. If you're asking for papers for people because of their appearance to be of a particular ethnic background.
Yeah, and there were actually there was some language in that in the consent decree with New Orleans too. But what more? I mean,
well, if you want to go back to the ancient history, also in there's biblical references to sanctuaries. in, let's see, in biblical times, people who had committed an accidental murder could flee to sanctuary cities where they could be safe until the death of the high priest who was
protecting
in
him,
power at the time of the,
Well, don't we have sanctuary? No, go ahead.
Well, and then in the Middle Ages also, person seeking sanctuary could go to a church for if they were accused felons because of the distinction between civil authority and papal authority or religious authority.
Right.
That they were protected, and it's kind of like, I guess, analogous to diplomatic protection when you're on the premises of
A foreign country's embassy, yeah.
Right. It's like you're in that other country. Well, you're in the church, you're in that other legal jurisdiction in the Middle Ages time, and so there was a sanctuary available that way. But more recently, there was a sanctuary movement in the 80s where there were churches that served as sanctuaries for immigrants who were fleeing civil war in Guatemala and El Salvador. And the churches there were actively giving sanctuary to specific individuals and protecting them from being taken into custody by federal agents.
And sent back to
And Reagan didn't want the bad publicity of invading churches to seize people, so it started in one church in Arizona, I believe, and then it spread to hundreds of churches across the country.
Yeah, I don't think Bill Clinton quite invaded a church, but he did have he apparently had no problem with Elian Gonzalez a ways back, sending troops into a private home to capture the boy and bring him back to Cuba. But anyway, you just reminded me of that. But yeah, actually, something you just said here also applies to the issue in New Orleans. The same spokesman, the police spokesman here, he's explaining the city's policy and how they're not going to change it. He says the police department's immigration policy does not make New Orleans a sanctuary city, he says. But he says New Orleans NOPD, New Orleans Police Department, will continue to work with federal immigration officials when there is a criminal warrant or following any crime. But their priority is going after violent criminals, not raiding churches and markets to intimidate immigrant communities or working with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement to rip mothers from their young children. And that there shows some humanity, I think, on the part of the police department and the people of New Orleans, as well as the churches. Or was it? Did you say it was states during the 80s that would protect?
Those were churches.
It was churches, yeah.
Yeah.
And I can understand that. I mean, you say that Reagan didn't want the bad publicity. I wouldn't want the painful guilt of sending people back to what I know is a horrible place. And I would add, especially because in Central America, that unrest is almost entirely due to American meddling over the past 100 and some odd years.
Well, in the 80s specifically was the Reagan policy in those countries.
Yeah, we were intervening in Nicaragua, I think. We disrupted their government. And, yeah, we've had a long history of sending in Marines to force striking workers back to work and everything. So,
yeah. But and that's still carrying repercussions today with immigrants fleeing the violence that still persists in those countries. Central American refugees, and there was a controversy over some statements that Hillary Clinton made about sending the children back to those countries that they have fled from.
Yeah, there was a time, not too many years ago, it may have been during Obama's administration, when we had a flood of kids coming from Central America,
just precisely a couple of years ago, yeah.
Because the violence was getting so bad down there.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to somebody the other day who mentioned that all those wars are basically grounded in the drug war. The initial policies of our government to stamp out the use of drugs, or to at least control the drug industry for limited benefits for certain people. But so we're causing these problems.
Yeah, the drug war violence in Central America and Mexico and other Latin American countries is more recent. Back in the 80s, it was more the anti-communism campaign by Reagan that was fueling Central American wars.
Okay, yeah, and of course, they already had their experiences with capitalism. Again, like us sending in the Marines and forcing their workers back to work and everything. And I mean, I don't espouse communism and I don't condemn capitalism outright, but I can understand these people going for an alternative, so to speak, you know. But what about the issue of fairness? I mean, we hear a lot of that today. People in America here say, well, we should throw them all out because it's just not fair. It's not right to let these people stay here and give them an amnesty. In fact, George W. Bush, the second President Bush, proposed legislation on immigration that would have granted the amnesty to the 12.5 million immigrants I think we had back then, the not illegal immigrants, and that was shot down by much of his political constituency because it wasn't fair.
Yeah, I think it also was blown out of the front pages with the attack on 9/11, because I think it was right before that is when it was gaining most attention.
Yeah, and as I understand it from getting ready for the show, the whole problem with the massive illegal immigration, I mean, we've always had it, but it became a bigger problem after the Homeland Security Act was passed and immigration into the United States became much more arduous, much more difficult. I mean, the people from Mexico and Central America were coming here because they were starving otherwise, and they had to get money for their families to, send the money back to their families to feed them. And now all of a sudden the barrier just went way up for them getting in, and they can't afford to wait a year to get through the laws to get into the country legally.
Well, and the economy depends on so much on their labor now, too. It would be very disruptive of the U.S. economy if probably half the restaurants would shut down.
Well, yeah,
hotels would shut down.
Interesting you should mention that. But before I bring this up, I'd like to remind the listeners, you're listening to A Pause for Thought with Lang Baker, Wayne Parker. You're welcome to call in 343-9927, 343-9927, and give us your 2 cents worth, or more even. Anyway, Lang, you mentioned how, kicking all the people out could cause problems, and I recall seeing a story way back when. I didn't know it was as far back as 2007, but this is a New York Times piece about a city that was very near to where I grew up in New Jersey, Riverside, New Jersey. And it states here that a little more than a year ago, this is like I said, 2007, September of 2007, a little more than a year ago, the township committee in this faded factory town became the first municipality in New Jersey to enact legislation penalizing anyone who employed or rented to an illegal immigrant. And within months, hundreds, if not thousands, of recent immigrants from Brazil and other Latin American countries had fled. The noise, crowding, and traffic that had accompanied their arrival over the past decade abated. The law had worked. But then he points out that with the departure of so many people, the local economy suffered. Hair salons, like you mentioned, restaurants and corner shops that catered to the immigrants saw business plummet. Several closed. Once boarded up storefronts downtown were boarded up again. And meanwhile, of course, the town was hit with 2 lawsuits challenging the law. And the story here goes on to state, so last week the town rescinded the ordinance, joining a small but growing list of municipalities nationwide that have begun rethinking such laws. And the mayor, George Conrad of Riverside, here is quoted as saying, I don't think people knew there would be such an economic burden. A lot of people did not look 3 years out. And that seems to be the case with humanity in general, really. We don't take a long-term view. And but, this got me to thinking, right now we supposedly have 11 million illegal immigrants in this country, and the president-elect has declared that he will have them all rounded up and shipped out immediately. And what's that going to do to our economy based on, these towns, these real-life situations where people, were shipped out or, scared out?
Yeah, well, there's a double whammy, because where is the money going to come from to pay for all the staff that's required to carry his policy into effect? And then what's going to be the impact when all those workers are no longer in the U.S. workforce?
Yeah.
I mean, the mayor of Santa Fe has seen ahead to what the consequences would be according, right along the lines of what you were describing in New Jersey. In a recent article in Rolling Stone magazine, he was quoted on that. If their city had to abandon its sanctuary status, he said, according to this article, we are largely dependent on the immigrant workforce in our tourism industry, in our film industry, in our culinary industries. The, quote, new immigrants, quote, they play a critical workforce component, and they provide the right skills and needed skills to be able to offer the services that have made Santa Fe so great.
Yeah.
So that's the reason he's given, one of the reasons at least, for continuing the sanctuary city policy in Santa Fe.
Yeah, I find it interesting that many of the people who like to scream states' rights and, federalism and all that are the ones insisting or justifying, punishing these sanctuary cities because they're not obeying federal law. And for me, anyway, like in many, many cases when the federal government gets involved in things like this, it's a kind of a ham-fisted approach, and really, I used to observe a lot or I'd like to say a lot back when I was a right-wing zealot, and I still kind of believe it now, is there's really no such thing in most cases of a national problem. It's just a whole collection of local problems all around the nation, and each one has its own unique characteristics and should be dealt with in accordance with those. I mean, if you've got a whole bunch of immigrants that are basically making your city work, you don't want to throw them all out, but the federal law, ideally, if it was implemented, it would do that.
Yeah, well, there's that aspect, and there's also how can the feds implement a single policy that tries to do the same thing everywhere. It's got to be tailored to the local situation. And who best knows the local situation than the locals? Yeah,
who knows it best, right? And that, to me, that's an argument for the conservative cause, and yet they're the ones beating the drum for this,
Yeah.
Or they seem to be.
It seems to me you do need a federal standard to protect against local tyranny and local violation of rights. So.
Yes. Well, the flip side of that, too, is I've read of and been told about one specific employer near where I lived years ago, who would hire illegal immigrants for their, for special projects in their businesses, and then when the project was finished, report them to INS and have them taken away.
Yeah.
And that's dirty pool, man. These people have no rights when they're in the country illegally already, and they're here working hard, but people can rip them off, and they're afraid to go to the police. They have no protection.
Yeah, that's another aspect of the sanctuary cities justification, is that by bringing them out of the shadows, then they can report crime and abuses, and that can lower the crime rate because the victims aren't afraid to report the crime, and so the criminals can be apprehended.
Right. There was a story I also read that came from PBS, actually, back in, it's just 2016, actually, November 2016, concerning sanctuary cities and whatnot, and it states here that many cities since Trump's election, mayors and police chiefs in more than 10 major cities, including San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., reaffirmed their commitment to upholding their sanctuary policies, even in the face of the federal threats to take away their, funding for them. And that's probably for that reason. They know these people. They live with these people. They know these people are, just as law-abiding as the rest of us. Of course, every population has its, or community has its percentage of people who commit crimes, but in general, they're not all bad. They're not all rapists and murderers and drug dealers.
Yeah, some studies have shown that the crime rate in immigrant communities is actually lower than in the general population. And
I wonder if that's because they have more social cohesion than we comfortable people do, the more comfortable people. Because I've noticed, and I think you have too, over the course of my life, the poorer communities often, unless they completely break down, but the poorer working communities often work together and share and help each other and support each other. And it's interesting. I remember I remember Oscar Wilde in his Ballad of Reading Jail. I can't pronounce the French word for it, so I'll say jail. But when he was in prison, he wrote a lamentation about the situation, and he said that, you know, people in my social stratus or social level or whatever don't seem that they're very callous toward people who do something wrong. You know, they think nothing of throwing them away and taking away their children and everything else. But the poorer people among them in their society looked at it as a misfortune and would basically say, well, you know, he's in trouble, he's having problems, you know, he's not they don't call him a dirtbag and write him off, they empathize with him. And I wonder if that's all part of it there. But what I was going to get back to in this KQED PBS story, they state here that the national debate over sanctuary cities resurfaced in 2015 when an undocumented immigrant with a long criminal history allegedly shot and killed a 32-year-old on a San Francisco pier. And they state here that the advocates of tougher immigration rules were very quick to blame the city for its policy of not cooperating with federal immigration agencies to hold and report potentially dangerous undocumented residents. And that's an exaggeration, really. I mean, that may have been what the people were claiming, but the fact is that particular illegal immigrant had been deported 4 times, and if the city of San Francisco had caught him, and they were trying to find him on drug-related charges, they would have deported him again. So far from being the fault of the city of San Francisco for protecting this guy, they were trying to arrest him and put him in jail and get rid of him.
Yeah, if there's any fault, it was allowing him back in the country.
Right, and you know, apparently, you know, I mean, well, let's face it, it's a long border.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying that there is fault
Yeah.
there. I'm saying if there were any fault,
Right, there would be that fault.
To there.
Well, you know, what do you think of building a wall all the way across from the Pacific to the Gulf of Mexico? Wouldn't that work?
It would be a boom for the construction industry, but I don't know, they'd probably have to hire a lot of illegal immigrants to have enough workers to build it.
Ooh, I haven't thought about that. That's kind of a low blow too, Lang. But you know, it's interesting. I just heard an excerpt of oh, doggone it. There it is. Retired Marine General John Kelly, who was has been picked to head up the immigration or the Homeland Security Department, I believe. And during his Senate confirmation hearings, he stated he was asked about the wall, you know, President-elect Trump's idea of the wall and what he thought of it. And he says, well, as a military man, I can say that just a single barrier will not do the job. You know, he was saying you need, for a proper defense to actually work, you need several successive barriers to whoever it is you're trying to protect yourself against. And he says a wall stretching all the way across our border was not going to do the trick. And
how many walls did he recommend?
Well, he didn't elaborate. He just said it, that he was asked to, you know, give his opinion of the wall, and that's what he said. The wall itself won't work. But here again, here's the economic impact of building a wall. Mm. You know, I don't believe that Mexico's going to pay for it.
You know, I think Trump now says that we'll pay for it up front, but they'll reimburse us.
Oh, yeah, no, yeah, but yeah. Well, he also mentioned earlier, I think, that he implied that they'll pay, but not necessarily with a cash payment. You know, so who knows what kind of punishment he's planning for that. But you're listening to Wayne Parker Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. You're welcome to call in and give your thoughts or ask some questions or challenge us on a point of view. 343-9927, 343-9927. You know, Lang, if we do build this wall, I would think construction companies are going to benefit quite a bit.
I would guess that's true.
Would they be perhaps in favor of the wall for that reason alone? I mean, is it unprecedented that corporations would intentionally push for legislation that benefited them?
Well, there seems to be a bit of a track record in the private prison industry on that point with construction of detention facilities for undocumented immigrants who are awaiting their deportation hearings. Back quite a while ago, and let's see how far it was, maybe back in the 90s, I think, there was a federal law passed that required that a certain number of beds, 34,000, I believe, something like that, for detainees be maintained at all time. And the overwhelming majority of those are in private prison facilities.
And who pushed that legislation?
Well, there's been quite a bit of lobbying expenditures and campaign contributions from the leading private prison corporations. A couple of them, the Corrections Corporation of America and the GEO Group. According to this report, between 2008 and 2014, the CCA spent over $10 million lobbying on issues related to immigration detention and immigration reform. That's from that one corporation.
Yeah,
Mostly lobbying the DHS Appropriations Subcommittee.
Okay, to get money to build the prisons and maintain them and all that, and
yeah, and to continue to require them. So these two prison corporations, CCA and the GEO Group, operate 72% of the privately contracted immigration detention beds.
yes, and there is usually a contract, as I understand it, with these private prisons where whatever government is funding them, whether it be a county or a state, organization, they're required. I mean, I've read where there are contracts that require a minimum number of prisoners to be maintained in the prison, or the state may be required to pay a compensation to
pay an empty bed fee of some
pay
kind.
The empty,
Yeah.
And so there's an incentive there to keep that going. I believe that Arizona's quite draconian immigration law some years ago, which garnered a lot of praise from certain segments, was written largely by Wackenhut, and which is a prison security industry, and a few others. I think the APEC you mentioned there, is it that they were part of ALEC, okay, but they were part of that, aren't they?
Yeah, that was another angle where the private sector has been involved in driving immigration policy. This was in Arizona back in around 2007, I believe it was. It was Senate Bill 1070 that was passed in Arizona, which included the papers, show me your papers provision.
That's right. It required the cops to demand the papers and the people to produce them. Otherwise they go to jail. I mean, right.
Whether you're here legally or not, whether you're native born or not, if you can't prove it, then the police could put you in jail. But that's been overruled subsequently. Right. But the bill itself was drafted by ALEC, which
is that lobbying group for prison industry.
It's more than that. It's a private organization with lots of corporations and state legislators from all over the country that get together in private meetings and draft so-called model legislation that then the legislative members of this organization go back to their home states and introduce that and push it through, even though it's actually written largely by the industries. And this particular Arizona bill was one of those bills, according to a study that NPR did, an investigation NPR did back some years ago.
Yeah, so it just seems like there's a whole lot of maybe it's extreme to say corruption in there, but
you might call it privatization of legislation.
Yeah, really.
We talked about privatization of government services.
You wouldn't say fascism, would you?
No, I'm talking about privatization.
Okay. But it's government funded, though, right? I mean, they're privatizing it, but it's taxpayer money that's paying these people, right?
Well, not the organization itself.
No.
But the
industries, the businesses, or the states, rather.
Yeah, they get the legislation passed, and in this case, it was because these private prison industries that were members of ALEC and met with these legislators to draft this bill were the ones who were going to benefit from it, because where are you going to put all these people after you've arrested them?
Right. Yeah, and then the prison industry, though, is what I'm saying would be benefiting from all that because they're the ones that are going to get the money in the end to maintain and build these prisons.
Yeah, what's a return on their investment? Their investment being what they pay their lobbyists and what they pay in campaign contributions.
Okay, well, Lang, we got to go. As usual, we didn't have a chance to cover everything, but I guess we covered some stuff anyway. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We've got to go now, so you guys have a good evening. Thank you for listening.